This is the last demonstration for this project. We've had a lot of demonstrations for it. This will be the last one. So this demonstration is just going to show you how to smooth out the tile after you're finished with everything. And I've done a lot of smoothing on this already, so there's not a whole lot left to do, but a little bit. First of all, you want to start with, pretty clean hands. I just rinsed my hands off because I had dried up chunks and cracked clay on my hands. And when you're doing the finishing, those little cracked clumps of clay will transfer onto your tile. So start with clean hands when you're finishing up your tile. You're going to want a dry paintbrush and also a paintbrush that you can use to dip into the slip. And you're going to want to have one of these double-ended carving tools. So the first thing I like to do is take the dry paintbrush and just use it to brush off any dried up little clumps of clay. This is the easiest way to get them off. You have to hold your tile in your hand. I actually like to hold it so it's like tilted down towards my clay board a little bit. And that way, when I brush the clumps of clay off, instead of them just going further down the tile, they actually go onto the clay board instead of somewhere else on the tile. So hold your tile up, tilt it a little bit towards your board, and then use the dry paintbrush to brush off all those little clumps of clay that can easily get brushed off. If there are clumps that are sticking that aren't coming off with the dry paintbrush, don't worry about it. Those will get taken care of with the next step. Okay, so first just get as much off as you can with the dry paintbrush. Once you've done that, put your tile back down, and then you can start to go in with slightly, you don't want a whole lot of slip on your paintbrush. You just want a little bit of slip. And any areas that look a little clumpy still, like I have a little area right here, you can take your wet paintbrush and smooth it out like this. And you can even get right up into the corner like that and pull it upward, and then get in this direction, do the same thing. And it really does help to smooth out these little small areas that your finger can't get into, okay? So use a small paintbrush for these little tiny areas to get into like that. And I've got these areas, I've done a lot of smoothing around here already, but these areas inside the tree roots really need to be done. So I'm just going to go in with the wet paintbrush again, like smooth it out as much as I can with the paintbrush, and then use this tool to finish up the smoothing. So I'm going to smooth the corner like this gently, wipe off the excess clay. If you don't wipe off the excess clay, that little clay chunk will go elsewhere on your tile, and then you'll have another place to clean it up. Just like all the other parts of this process, it takes a lot of slow, careful attention to detail and patience to work carefully. And then I can go downward like this and use the bottom of this curved tool to do some smoothing out like this. It's really hard to get into these tiny little areas to smooth. And then I would go back in one more time with my paintbrush, the wet paintbrush, not the dry one, and just do some finishing smoothing like that. Okay, that looks good enough to me, that one. So then I would just do the same thing moving on to the next one. Okay, if at this point you have seen that some of the stamps that you've done disappeared a little bit, you can go back in and just carefully stamp back in again. I think the only spots where I see that need to be restamped are maybe a little bit on this one and a little bit on this one right here. And so I would just very carefully, you don't, at this point with leather hard clay, you don't want to be pressing down too hard because you could crack your whole tile, but you can just take the stamp and just rock it back and forth to get the impression back in there a little bit more in any areas where you lost a little bit of the detail of your stamps if you chose to use stamps on yours. And that's pretty much it. Okay, so all you have to do is, first thing, hold your tile like this so it's slightly tilted towards your clay board. First, you're going to use your dry paintbrush. Brush off all the little bits of dried clay that you can with the dry paintbrush. Then lay it back down. Use another paintbrush in the wet slip. Don't use a ton of slip. You don't want clumps of slip on your brush. You just basically want a little bit, about, say, this much slip in your paintbrush. And in any areas that still need to be smoothed out, you're going to paint over it first, like this. Then come in with your curved carving tool. Or if it's a large enough area that you can reach with your finger, use your finger. But if it's a small area that you can't reach, just lightly and carefully use your carving tool. Smooth out the area as best you can with that. And then one more time over with the wet paintbrush. And that's it. That's pretty much it. You want your tile to be as smooth as possible unless you have intended texture. All the areas where you have intended texture, obviously you're going to keep, such as my spotty texture that I have in my tree branches, all these leaves. Obviously that texture needs to stay bumpy. I'm not smoothing that out. I've got a little bit of hair texture in the hair here. But what I did do, I left the texture of the hair, but I made sure to get every clump of clay out. Because when you use the needle tool to create texture like hair texture, it creates these little clumps of clay. So I just did a little bit more on this hair right here. And if I put it close, you can see that doing that created some little clumps of clay. So if you're wanting to keep your intended texture, just make sure that you brush off those extra bits of clay, those little clumps. And then you can just a tiny bit use some slip to really smooth out the clumps, but keep the texture. Okay, so you can still see the lines of the hair in there. You just don't see any more of those little clay clumps that resulted from scratching the texture into the clay. And that's it. That is all you need to do. When you are finished carving and using your applique technique and you're all done with the subtractive and additive parts of your tile, then all there is left to do is this finishing and smoothing to make sure that your tile looks the best it can before it dries. Okay? Any questions about that? All right.